Hey guys, welcome back to the Blender Workshop. Have you had a break? I'm sorry for the past segments being very dry, but I guess the fun part like kind of start now when we start setting up the scene and start rendering for real. So first thing you do is to create a new collection over here. Right click and just create a new collection. You can call this one environment. Is what I usually call it, right? So the first thing you need to do is to add a ground plane. Actually, let me move myself away so you can see. Right, add a ground plane. To add anything in Blender, you would Shift and then Shift A to add anything. In this case, you want to add a plane right here. Right, so you have a plane. But well, usually for like a plain background render, you want like have a continuous backdrop that go all the way to like the horizon, that kind of thing. So what you do is actually just to press on the ground plane over here, and then press tab. You're gonna go into this thing called edit mode. You can actually access edit mode by just like click on this drop down menu and go here, edit mode. You see these three buttons. You can actually select the second one, which lets you select like the edges. So select the edges, the back. And now we're gonna make a continuous backdrop by pressing E to extrude. This is the only kind of modeling that I do in Blender. I actually do not know how to model in Blender, so this is the only modeling you're gonna be doing. E to extrude, Z to lock it to the Z axis, and so now you cannot have a backdrop, right? In order to make this backdrop like a continuous surface, you would click on this like edge over here, right? Control B to bevel, and then just drag it until you see like a chamfer over here. And if you scroll up on your mouse wheel, you can actually see more segments, and now it's like a continuous surface. Click to lock your curve in place, and then press tab again to get out edit mode back into object mode, like over here, right? You can kind of see these lines. Right, so to get rid of this line is actually very simple. You press, you select the plane, and right click, shade smooth. Right, so now it's smooth, which is nice. It's a bit narrow as well. So if you remember from the previous video segment, we actually can shift. We can scale this by pressing S, and then X to scale it, to lock the scaling to the Z direction. Right, and then in this case just press 2 to duplicate it, like to times 2 our scaling, right? So now we have a ground plane. It's very easy. Yeah, applicable to many different things as well. So we kind of have a round plane. The next thing that we need is a camera and then a light, right? To add a camera, usually I would press 1 to go into the front view because you want the camera to look directly at the pen design here, like such. So again, Shift A to add anything, right? We're gonna choose the camera, and now we have a camera. If you drag your mouse up here, you see a plus sign. You can actually just press on it and drag. If I can do it properly, oh my god. You can press on it and drag, yeah. So you see a new window here. This window, usually I would just set it as like the rendered sort of image by just pressing 0, so it's going to the render like window over here, like that. So now you can sort of move the camera around to make sure that it's looking at the design properly. I do this by going to the side view, and then just press, if you remember, G to move the camera around. And now if you move back, you can actually see the design like this, right? Next thing we need to do is to add a very simple light. Right, so how do we do that? Again, Shift A to add anything in Blender, and in the light menu, usually to set up like just the material, I'll use an area light like this, and then want to go to the front view, and then GZ to move it upwards. So maybe around here, I actually don't know. Right, so if we click this button, if you remember, like this button is gonna take you to the rendered mode. You can see that our pen is rendered, but it still look like Keyshot. So how to make it look less like Keyshot, I guess. The first thing you do is the light over here. If you go to this tab over here, like here you can see a light bulb. It's actually the material setting for the light. Using white color, it's actually doesn't make it look as realistic as using like some color from the Kelvin scale to make it look a bit like, you know, natural sunlight and things like that. So if you see down here in nodes, you can actually click on use nodes, and under color we click on this yellow small yellow circle. You can see black body, I think. Right, so black body is gonna make the light color, it's gonna overwrite the white color, like the color over here, with this sort of like temperature scale. Right now you see 1500, like 1500 makes it very warm. So I find somewhere around 6000 to 6500 to be the most neutral looking. If you go a bit higher than that, it looks a bit cold. But in this case, I think I'm gonna use 6300. Yeah, so if you want to see the before and after, you can actually just go here into shading, right, like this. Press 0 again to go to our render window. Press on this. You can actually see without black body and with black body, there's a tint of warmth added. Very, very minor, but it actually makes some kind of difference, I guess. To have like a tint of sort of skylight, right? So next thing is the camera itself. Right, so for the camera, it's quite nice. Like most of the time, it's actually nice to have the focal length set at around 100 to 120 millimeters. Essentially, it's gonna make everything looks a bit flatter, and I guess more flattering for products in general to have like a flat look instead of like a fisheye lens look. So crank this value to a high number like 100 in this case. I think it's fine. Yeah, and then you can actually G to move and Y to move the camera further away a bit, right? Something like that, maybe. Yeah, so right now it doesn't really look very realistic yet because we haven't really added like the material and everything. So next we're gonna be adding some material to this pen, and as I said, like the fastest way is actually just go here and mess with these, but to get more control over the material, usually we go to shading. In here you can actually have a bit more control. So if you select this, down here you can see that it's diffuse black. I think it just default Rhino export says diffuse black. Okay, so now I'm gonna just quickly go through like this thing called the principled BSDF. Essentially this, with just this, you can get any material, like maybe not wood, any material that is not image based, right? Like procedurally generated texture. It's gonna be controlled via this principled BSDF, right? Let me just go down the menu. First you see base color. So this is very straightforward. Base color is just essentially like the color of the material. This is gonna make it very white. Yeah, and so I guess I just set it to like a nice yellow color as such. Right. The next thing is subsurface. Subsurface is the kind of thing that you see on human skin. For example, you shine a light through your earlobe, you can actually see through it, and it's like a reddish tint. So subsurface is gonna do exactly that. I guess I can try to demonstrate. So if you crank subsurface, right now it's a bit bluish because under subsurface radius, you want to make all these value pretty much the same. Like I find the value of 0.01 sort of like make it look the best, make it look like silicone, you know, like a bit see-through. Yeah, right now it's looking white because subsurface color, we also need to change this to like maybe like a warm-ish color. Yeah, so it's gonna make the material a bit like see-through, but not really. It's like a silicone-like material, skin-like material. So that is subsurface, right? But I don't think it's very nice for this pen anyway because it's gonna be hard ABS plastic. So, right. So right now we don't care about these so much. Right, next thing is metallic. Metallic is very straightforward. There are only two values. There's nothing. Metallic will never be anywhere in between this. It's either 0 or 1. So 0 is gonna be like a non-metallic sort of material, and 1 is gonna be a totally metallic material, right? So I guess because it's plastic, we're just gonna use it. We're gonna put 0 over here again, no value in between, 0 or 1. Specular actually should always stay, I mean, in most of the time, it should stay at 0.5. I do not have like a very good reason for this. I just did some research, and a lot of Blender pros say that specularity, if you set it at 0.5%, 0.5 as a value, it's gonna help with realism. So yeah, I listen to them, right? So the next thing is, I guess, applicable to like our render is gonna be roughness. So this is gonna make it glossy, as you can see here. Your object is gonna look very glossy. Actually, let me turn this up. Turn this down. 0.001. Clip start. Yeah. As you can see, it's very glossy, and crank this number is gonna be very rough. So somewhere in between would be nice. Like that, I think. Yep. Anisotropic and anisotropic rotation is only applicable when you work with metal, for example. So let me demonstrate very quickly. So if this is like a metallic thing, and if you crank anisotropic, you can actually see sort of like the swirl on the metal, and the rotation of the anisotropic is gonna just essentially like rotate that swirl, as you can see. Yeah, a little bit. Yeah, it's like the metallic grain. I actually don't use this much because I don't think it makes a lot of difference unless you're rendering like anything with like a brushed metal look. You probably want to use these values to control that. Yeah. Okay. The sheen is applicable when you render something like fabric. So you can see a bit of like a shim, I guess, on the fabric itself. So towards the edges, it's gonna look a bit like whited out. Yeah, especially on fabric. So if you're rendering fabric, you wanna turn on sheen and the sheen tint as well. But for now, we're just gonna turn these off because we're rendering on plastic. Clear coat essentially is just gonna add like a clear coat layer on top of the material that you're already having. So say for example, I put the clear coat value of 3. Now it's gonna have like, it's gonna coat this material with like a gloss, like on top of what is underneath. Yeah, and the clear coat roughness is gonna dictate like how glossy or like how rough it actually is. Right, so in this case, I don't need a coating on this, so I'm just gonna set it back to 0. Next we have transmission, which is gonna make it essentially like clear. As you can see now, it's like glass-like material, and if you decrease the roughness, you can see it's like clear glass. You can see like all the components inside, and you can dictate the color up here of the glass. The glass is gonna have a tint like this. The difference between the roughness value, say if you have glass, when you crank transmission to 1, for example, you have roughness, and you also have transmission roughness. You can see down here. Roughness is it only has to do with the surface of the mesh, right? Transmission roughness actually put like say little bubbles within like the material. So this roughness value is only with the surface, and this transmission roughness is within the material itself. Yeah, I guess it's something nice to know. And usually I'll just set like roughness. If I want to make like a frosted look, I just roughness, because usually just sand like the surface, unless you want to go for like the bubble look inside the glass itself, then you would go for transmission roughness instead. Yeah. Okay, I think maybe a bit more vibrant, perhaps. right? Emission is essentially if you want to make your material shine, right? Is simply that. So like say if I put it to like a bright color, as you can see that it's sort of like glowing here a little bit, right? Yeah, and you can also set the strength to very bright or like very dim, that kind of thing. So these are the nice to have Blender. Right. And alpha is simply the transparency of the material. So now it's like opaque. This is nice when you want to like render the interior of the design and you want to showcase like the parts inside. It's where you control that. So the alpha, you lower this value, you can see through the material a bit. It takes away the realism. Usually I just put it at 1 if I want to render something more realistically. But yeah, it's a nice thing when you want to show some sort of like internal components, things like that, right? Okay, to quickly go through how I actually set up a material, I would use some very simple node setup. I would recommend you to look at Blender Guru or any other YouTubers, Blender YouTubers for their node setup. I think Blender Guru has very straightforward tutorials for this, but like the fastest setup that I find work in many cases is to simply have a bump. So again, you press Shift A. Actually, let me see if I can turn on this. Apparently not. Right. So just press Shift A to add anything in Blender, and you just would search for bump. Right. Yeah. And next thing you want to add is a noise texture. So Shift A, and then noise texture. So what this does is it's gonna allow the material to have some sort of like surface irregularities, which gonna make it look a bit more realistic, right? So the normal here, you're gonna plug into normal, and the noise texture, the factor, you're gonna plug into the height. So I can see now it's not looking so good. Essentially, like the texture is way too big as of now. So and it's looking quite gross, right? So what you need to do is actually to turn on an add-on that let you quickly access the sort of like texture coordinate. I know that these words probably don't make sense for some of you, but essentially it's just letting you control like the orientation and the scaling of the texture more effortlessly. So in add-on, you're gonna search for Node Wrangler. This one, you just check on the checkbox and it's gonna be on, and then for the next time as well. So you don't have to worry about this again. Right, so just add on Node Wrangler, check the checkbox, and over here noise texture, if you press Ctrl T, you have access to the texture coordinate and like the location, rotation, and scale of the texture. Usually for objects imported from Rhino, I just use object coordinate, like to just plug into the vector as such, and already it's looking a bit better, I think. Yeah, so you can see these bumps. In detail, actually, I would crank this up all the way to 16, and roughness to a bit of a higher value. And you can also make the scaling, like if you increase the value over here, is gonna decrease the texture size on here. So it's gonna look like the grain is gonna be smaller. So I guess from afar it looks okay. Yeah. So that is material, right? Actually we can, okay, that's not material. Okay, so now we have like sort of like a plastic look to everything, but we also have other things as well. So let me introduce you to some mapping, right? So if you select this screen over here, if I just select this and click on the eye icon to hide it, this screen, you can click this button over here to duplicate this same material, and you can rename it to something else. In this case, we're gonna just call it screen. So say if you have this part, for example, and you want to assign it to a different material, you would select the part, go into this, click on onto this icon, and you have access to all these material over here, and you can just assign it by clicking onto the material you want it to have, right? In this case is diffuse black. I should change this to like plastic. Right, yeah. So if you click on the screen over here, and you assign this new material called screen that we just called it, you can unselect this like that, or a faster way is just because you already enabled Node Wrangler, the add-on just now, you can actually just press Control and then right click, and the knife's gonna come through and you can slice the node as such. Very convenient tool. And in order to preview what the node looks like without going through the BSDF or like anywhere along your node setup, you can actually, this is for the more advanced user, you can actually just press, I think it's control shift, and then yeah, control shift, and then select the node, and then it's gonna like reflect it directly like through the viewer without going through the BSDF. Yeah, and then you can plug this back into normal, slice it, and then right now if you control shift click on this, you can see that it's plugged into the surface. Yeah, so that is a nice shortcut to have. Control right mouse click to slice, and yep, like that. It's very fast. For this one, I actually want to project like a texture, like an image texture onto it. So again, to add anything in Blender, you would Shift A and then search for image texture. Over here, you want to press on the open thing and locate what texture you want to load in. In this case, I already prepared like a screen texture. Right, so this is actually an MP4 file. You can actually just import a normal PNG file or like a JPEG file. It should be okay. But in this case, because I have some animation and the screen is gonna have this animation as well, so I think it's nice as a demonstration to just import like this MP4 file, right? I already know that my MP4 file has 900 frames, so if you know the frame size, you should key in as such, and you can determine like what the start frame should be. In this case, it's 1, and there's no offset. Essentially, you want to start at frame 50, you would just offset this by like 50, right? It's also important to click to check the cyclic box, so it's gonna cycle through. So when the animation ends, like this video ends, it's gonna run again, and also auto refresh. So like every frame is different. So this you can now play like over here in real time. In the material preview, shading mode, yeah, right. This one you can actually just plug directly into the base color like this one, and you can already see that it's there, but well, nothing is really there yet, because you would have to go, you would have to map it properly, right? I think the roughness can also decrease a little bit so it looks a bit more glossy, right, like that. So now we need to map this texture onto this thing over here, and you do this in, I forgot to mention this, but UV editor is quite important when you want to map texture, things like that. And this is a bit complicated, and I think you really want to delve deep into wrapping textures and things like that, you should watch Render Guru's tutorials on that. It's very helpful. But for the purpose of like industrial designers, we want to mostly just map things onto flat things. So yeah, in here, if you press 1 to go to the front view, you can see it's like as such, and maybe I can scrub through a bit more so you can actually see the face here. If you click on this icon, you can actually see the kind of image you're going to be mapping this to. So here you have a face, nice. You would want to select the front face, like this one, for example, and then go to the front view, because you want to project it directly on top of the mesh. Let me check. Right, okay. On top of the mesh. So what you do in this case is to click on UV, project from view, and as you can see here, it's like the shape the vertex shape sort of take the shape of the design itself, so it's no longer stretched. So what you do is pressing A to select every single vertex here, R to rotate if you remember, and 90, just type in 90, it's gonna rotate 90 degree as such, and now you can scale it and make sure that you know it's covering the design like this, for example. Looks okay. Yeah, and then if you go back to shading, you can actually check, and yeah, as you can see, the design is loaded onto the material itself. Usually it's usually, right, you would change this setting to clip instead of repeat. So now you kind of have an image texture on here, which is nice, right? Let me just select everything here because we don't need them anymore. Make it nice and clean. Usually for screen material, you wanna add like some kind of emission because you know screen reflects light and things like that. So you can actually just select this and then plug this into emission, and to really demonstrate, you can actually crank this and you can see that it's getting really bright, but I think it's a bit too bright, right? You can actually do some post-processing to like the screen texture here as well. Yeah, so shift, right click, select these two to combine these lines into like one line, and you can actually add like another node in between this and the principal BSDF to output to the emission and the base color, right? So in this case, I want to add like a hue saturation. For example, if you add a hue saturation, you can actually control the hue, different colors. You can animate them very fast, like this. I think 0.5 is okay. The saturation as well. So this is very saturated, and this is like, you know, very desaturated. Maybe I want to put the saturation to be a bit higher, right? And also the value, you can like make it brighter or darker, depends, right? So now we kind of have a screen, which is nice. If you remember, we actually turned this off. We hid it in the viewport, so we turn this on. This I would like to have like a glass material on top of it. So if you remember, we need to duplicate the material, because if we edit directly on this, for example, if we want to make a glass and we crank the transmission, as you can see, everything is changed, which is not what we want. So before we edit the material, we have to duplicate it by pressing this button. So now it's like plastic.001. When I change this value, this string to like something else, say glass, for example. Yeah, delete everything here because we don't need it. Base color, the glass, I guess it's gonna be a bit tinted black, so desaturated, and the base color to be a bit darker. Roughness to decrease a little bit, and transmission to increase as such. Right now it's looking a bit dull, so if you press 0, you go here, looking a bit dull. So I think the screen itself should have like a brighter, more vibrant, kind of more saturated. Just crank these numbers, make it really like, I think it's a bit much here, right? I think something like this looks alright. Yeah, something like this looks okay, I guess. I think the face can look a bit bigger. So if you click on like the screen over here and go back to UV editing, in order to make the face bigger, you select everything here by pressing A, and then S, and then scale it down a little bit. So the face takes a bit more screen space, right? Go back to layout and you kind of have a thing, which is quite nice, I guess. Right now, I think material is pretty much done. Yeah, so that concludes the segment on material and texture. Next we're gonna be doing a bit of lighting. See you guys in the next segment.